Welcome to Boswell Book Company's virtual event series. It is day 4,312 of us being in business, and we are honored tonight to be hosting Jeff Porter, the author of Planet Claire, Suite for Cello and Sad-Eyed Lovers. And as a very special treat, he is in conversation with Meghan Daum, the author of numerous books. And here is a little more about the book. Kirkus Reviews called Planet Claire a haunting and thought-provoking consideration of death and how it utterly rips apart our lives. And Richard Preston wrote, when a person dies, a world passes away, yet Porter has created a cabinet of wonders out of 1,000 bits of the world that vanished when his wife died. The sentences are sharp and surprising, perfectly formed, by turns painful, funny, haunting, and inevitably right. Porter is also the author of Lost Sound, The Forgotten Art of Radio Storytelling, the memoir Oppenheimer is Watching Me, and co-editor of Understanding the Essay. His essays have appeared in magazines and literary journals such as the Antioch Review and Shenandoah, and up until recently, he taught English at the University of Iowa. Meghan Daum is the author of several books, including The Unspeakable and Other Subjects of Discussion, which won the 2015 Penn Center USA Award for Creative Nonfiction, as well as My Misspent Youth and Life Would Be Perfect If I Lived in That House. Thank you both so much for coming. Welcome virtually to Milwaukee from wherever you are. At least the travel was cheap. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel. Jeff, congratulations.
Well, thank you, Megan. It's so good to see you again.
It's good to see you. I feel like I always see you on a screen. I think the last time I saw you, we were on a thesis committee at Iowa.
That's right.
You were probably looking at me on some abominably oversized screen in a small classroom, and I was looking at you on my laptop. So I'm really excited to talk about this book, and thanks Boswell Books for having us. I love Milwaukee. I say that in all sincerity. It played a pivotal role in my childhood for various reasons. So I wish we were there in person, but this is the next best thing. So Jeff, as you know, the blurb on the back of your book says that Planet Claire is not just one of the best grief memoirs I've read in recent years, but one of the best memoirs, just period, full stop. And, you know, in thinking about why that is, and, you know, I read a fair amount of memoir and I teach memoir, and it's something I think about quite a bit. You have this incredible ability in this book to sort of swing back and forth between different modes. There are moments of devastating sadness, but you can like really quickly shift to something that's really sort of buoyant, and you know, we go from this sort of gravity to this almost sort of surreal hypothetical mode. So I do want to have you read a little bit, but before we get into that, I'm curious if you could, like, first of all, tell us what the book is about, if people don't know, in just the most rudimentary sense, and then maybe tell us like how you achieved this tone. Did it come quickly, or was it something that evolved after many drafts? Okay,
all right. Thanks for that blurb. I kind of like that blurb from one of my favorite writers. The book is about the loss of one's spouse. In my case, my late wife died really abruptly. It was so unexpected. And so there was enormous, it was an enormous catastrophe in my life, and I didn't really know how to respond. And I'm a language person, and so I immediately began talking even before. Claire was in intensive care for about 3 days, but she suffered from a massive brain aneurysm, so there was really, no sign of life. And it was just it was sort of amazing just to see her there hooked up to the machinery. The book begins with her hooked up to all these machines, which are recording and documenting the fact that she's really not there in her head. And to me, it was such an enormous irony that this woman, remarkable woman, who's really, really very intelligent, one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, to show no sign of life in her mind. And so I was, with this kind of spectacle for 3 days and had to deal with it. And being a language person, I just started talking. And this is really how the book began. I began talking out of desperation. I began talking to her, and of course the nurses in the intensive care unit were a little concerned when I first began talking, because I was alone with her in the room, and they'd see me talking, and they began wondering about me too. But I began doing this, and after a while, I realized I was sort of replaying one of my favorite movies by Pedro Almodovar, and that was Talk to Her. It's such an affecting movie. It's about these two really sensitive Spanish men who are very close to women who are comatose. So they're in the hospital, and they're just stretched out in their beds, and these men talk to their companions, and they just simply carry on, filling in their companions with news of the day. I began doing that out of desperation, and then when Claire died, officially, I kept doing it because there was it was necessary to create an imaginary other, or I would really lose my mind. So it's I suppose in a way, it wasn't therapeutic. It was kind of an act of desperation. And the thing that I do is, as a language person, is I talk and I write. So I did both. I began talking, and then I began writing that down, and that construct just stayed with me. And then, it became a literary thing, a literary event in the book, that there really was this very, very important imaginary other that I was talking to. And I think the reason why that particular device, the second person, which I've never been really fond of as a reader or as a writer, why it lasted is because, in answer to your second question, it put me in a very different relationship to writing. So I couldn't write the way that I used to write. I'm embarrassed to say that I'm in the past, I've always liked writing eloquently. I love eloquence, so
I don't think you gave up eloquence, so you're selling yourself short here.
Well, the kind of eloquence is sort of becomes a little bit too stately and a little too full of itself. And I immediately wanted to do those sentences because, after all, this was the biggest thing that ever had happened to me, and it really was tragic with the capital T. It was Shakespearean moment, my Shakespearean moment, and I couldn't help but respond kind of like that. And then talking to this imaginary person, which was so necessary for writing, didn't allow me to do that. In fact, the other person kept kind of winking at my sentences, because Claire would make fun of my eloquence, and I say that in the book, and it's quite true. And it was, thank goodness she would do that. I would get carried away, and she would wink at me. And so I sort of had that feeling. So that imaginary other there had a way of kind of splitting my imagination into 2 or 3 different parts. And so I had to say something. I couldn't just count on that kind of beautiful lyrical writing. Okay. There had to be something else, because I know the other person would be dissatisfied if it was only that, because the other person didn't buy that as an appropriate response to what had happened. So I started kind of like going into different parts of my imagination that I'd never visited as a writer. And Space Boy came out of there. And Space Boy,
I want to talk about Space Boy, your alter ego, and any number of other things. But can you read just a short excerpt, Jeff?
Yeah.
And actually, I want to say to everybody who's on Zoom, you can feel free to write your questions in the chat box just throughout our conversation, and I'll integrate them into our talk. We don't necessarily have to wait till the end, like a normal formal reading, as if we were all here. So feel free to let loose. So yeah, Jeff, give us a little taste.
I will do that, Megan. I'm going to just read a little 3-minute snippet from the prologue, and the prologue is the last thing I wrote, as is usually the case. So the prologue introduces what's happened, and it's kind of pretty straightforward. My wife died abruptly, and now I have to deal with it, and it's really almost impossible to deal with. So I'm halfway through the prologue, and I'm saying this. When your partner dies, everything around you seems to collapse. You look deep within yourself, not for courage, just for the wherewithal not to lose your car in a parking garage. Please don't let me lose my car tonight in the hospital parking garage. The bigger question, which you don't dare ask yourself, is how to keep the nothing that is now you from exploding into bits and pieces that spiral into outer space. Nothing is more real than nothing, wrote Beckett. Nothing is a word that sticks around like flies in August or shadows in October. It's very complicated to write about death. Wish I didn't have to do it. Can you ever not know again? Not knowing about death is really good. To be so naive, maybe innocent too. I don't think I can do this alone. I don't think you can either. Sooner or later it comes to death. Love flirts with grief every hour of the day. Outside my study, a road worker, brown overalls, is breaking up my street with a T-shaped jackhammer and is making ear-shattering sounds. Better that, though, than silence. Silence is scary. When the Lamb broke open the seventh seal, says the book of Revelation, there was silence. Now that's spooky. The dead air, like dead air on radio. Life is deafening. In the Bergman film, The Seventh Seal, death follows a medieval knight returning home from the Crusades. He is a bitter man, weary and disillusioned, troubled by the silence of God in the face of so much dying. He meets a stranger who doesn't look too chirpy. Who are you, asks the knight. I am death, says death. You have come for me, asks the knight. I have been at your side for a long time, says death. The knight is worried that life is nothing more than senseless terror, so he asks death to play a game of chess, to extend life just long enough to find some answers. If death is the only certainty, what else is there? Death shrugs his shoulders and accepts the challenge. The knight suddenly feels inspired. I, Antonius Block, am playing chess with death, he says. Death doesn't really care one way or another. He just looks bored in his ominous black cloak. His indifference is beyond terror. The crazy jackhammer pounds the street, bashing through concrete, bone-jarring steel on stone, bits of rock flying off. How does the road worker survive that commotion? Bang, crack, whack. Things are always flying off, more than we know, I think. Sometimes disastrously. It's the law of centrifugal force. Everything is in flight from an imaginary center. Dragonflies, beetles, turtles, swallows, desert nomads, comets, asteroids. Asteroids are the worst because they're rocky and bulky. The Kuiper Belt is teeming with asteroids, short-period comets and icy bodies, also dwarf planets and little moons. 100 years ago, an asteroid from the Kuiper Belt exploded over Siberia. It just flew off into space. It had no business crashing in Siberia, but there it was, a large flying rock. The fireball wiped out 2,000 square miles of taiga forest. There was a mighty boom, 80 million trees went up in flame. The explosion rocked the earth, split the sky in two. The jackhammer has stopped. The peonies are exhausted. There hasn't been rain in 2 weeks. I am wearing a black sweatshirt, blue jeans, and Converse sneakers. I look like a man who is quietly at work. But in my head, asteroids are crashing into Earth with the force of atom bombs. And I can stop here.
Thank you. So one of the things I do when I teach first-person narrative nonfiction is offer students what I call a memoir checklist. And it's a list of 10 items that ideally an author needs to say yes to before he or she sets out to write a memoir. So some of the things are sort of straightforward, like, am I the ideal person? Am I the only person who can be telling this particular story? Or do I know what the story is? Do I just know what the themes are, the ideas are? But one of the items is, are the events that I am writing about sufficiently enough in the past? And that's something that really trips people up, I think, because, or it certainly gives them pause, because I think a lot of writers try to write about things while they're still going on. So I'm curious when you knew it was time to start this project.
Well, no time passed at all. And so, in fact, it was, I was a little frightened by the, the urgency, because I'd never written anything under such urgency. It's, it's a kind of academic posture where you think you have 200 years to finish a book.
No, it only feels like 200 years while you're writing.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it takes that long.
Yeah.
But this was sort of like real life. Real life happened, and it I was in time, and time didn't really make any sense because it was so compressed. And I didn't know how to read time, but I just felt like I needed to do this to stay alive, and I needed to do it before I died. And you lose a spouse, and you feel like, well, you're next. Mm-hmm. And as part of the book also is that we lost our dog just maybe 6 months earlier. And, we were adults, a married couple without kids. And so we projected quite a bit on the dog, and the dog was sort of very, very close. And, when the dog died, I mean, we were both very, very frightened, Claire more than I. And I think she was tuned into something that I was just too dull to understand, that something had changed in our lives because the dog had died. And so I think that, the dog died, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, Claire died. And I, honestly felt like I'm next.
Yeah.
These things happen in threes. And so I did feel like I was racing against a concept of time that was new to me. I'd always taken it for granted. That's what we do. But now I had entered a wormhole where things didn't make sense anymore. I mean, I didn't know how much time I had. And so it was, in a way, writing was a way of just traveling through this wormhole. Otherwise, it would tear me apart.
That's remarkable, because I think you may be exceptional in this case. Like, you really, because the book does not have that sort of, not quite baked feeling you get with some memoirs. You can tell people still haven't processed it. You can tell that they haven't quite gotten out of the situation, or they haven't quite just made sense of it on their own terms. And I didn't get that sense from reading this, but I think at the same time, it does feel urgent. And listening to you talk, I bet that's because the conceit of the book in and of itself is this kind of real-time cognitive, psychological rumination, right? So were you, like, when you were in the hospital talking with her, were you actually, like, writing things down? Were you taking notes, like, physically, or, like, thinking, like, how can I sort of metabolize this in a sort of literary form that can even just make sense to me as a person, not even thinking of writing a book? I mean, how much of the book were you writing in your head, consciously or not, in the very early stages of this?
I think in the earliest stages, in the intensive care stages, no. I mean, it really was sort of, it was just a way for me to kind of remain conscious in the situation. But I think it was maybe a week after Claire had died, I began taking walks, and the walks were like talking, as a way of just sort of trying to remain conscious and functional. And so I took long walks, and I just looked at everything much more intensely than I ever before. But that's part of the trope of grief. I think you just look at the world differently because the world is vastly different. But I think at that point I started forming sentences that were literary in my head. And I'd go back, that wasn't bad. I better get it down on paper when I get home. So yeah, embarrassingly, yeah, I mean, I started composing, but it really wasn't like, oh, I'm taking a walk. Why don't I do what, literary people do, form beautiful sentences and thoughts and then get it down paper. No, I just sort of kind of, seeing things I hadn't seen before. and also very aware again of time, very aware of time.
Like you thought you were gonna die? What do you mean when you say you're aware of time?
I felt like the time it somehow had been triggered, and that it, had never really been triggered before. It was always dormant. I suppose it's kind of like having a bad gene that suddenly triggers something awful inside of your body. So like time had been sleeping in my case, in my life, and now it had been triggered, it had been turned on, and it was something I didn't understand, and made me really, really scared, but also very exciting too. Because I felt, it sounds like a cliche, but fearing the universe, the inscrutability of the universe. Why did this happen? And I'll never understand. And it's just, I'm going, how can we exist when we don't understand something as important as this? And we're clueless. We really are really, really clueless. And so I just felt like the world suddenly was there, and it was asking me to kind of witness it and to do with it whatever I could possibly do. And so in a way, I felt like, I was called to kind of be aware of these terrible things, and to just try to wrestle with it.
You're so specific in moments. I mean, early on, you talk about being in that ICU unit. You write, there are 6 rows of squiggly lines on the Philips monitor above your bed. You're talking to Claire, all different colors. How do you remember that? Write that down?
No, I didn't write it down, believe it or not. And I didn't even take an iPhone photo because it just didn't seem right. It was hard to forget that. I mean, so for 3 days, that's all there was. There were a lot of monitors, and that one monitor, was all about her life. Right. And I going, my God, this line here is the carbon content, oxygen content, heartbeat, and then, and because she had signed donation forms, the monitor was really big, and it was very important for the nurses who were caring for Claire, to keep her organs refreshed. And so that was ghoulish, and I mean, wow. And so the monitor was really present, and the irony of the monitor just kind of spoke to me, and it was hard to forget.
Yeah, I bet.
It's impossible to forget that monitor.
So tell us about your alter ego, Space Boy.
So Space Boy didn't show up right away. It took several months of writing, and the writing was, there's a lot of walking, and then there was the reminiscing parts, kind of recollecting and then reconstructing these moments from our life together. And then, I was creating a voice that didn't seem right. Again, it was that sort of eloquent voice, and I just was unsatisfied with it, and I was getting more and more impatient, and I knew that wasn't just the right register all by itself. And so once I realized that, once I became really dissatisfied with that voice, which is my major voice, I got a little scared about the project, and that's when I moved into another part of my imagination that as a writer I'd never go, because I'm supposed to be an intelligent adult, and I went to the adolescent part of my brain, and started acting that role. I would act that role, because that's the part of me that seemed to have taken off. And I remember quite vividly, I mean, this is sort of a psychological thing, is that I remember very vividly that something left right away. Some part of me left. This was very, very shortly after Claire died. I just felt like something, went away. And I didn't know exactly what it was. And so I used that voice that was newly available to me because of my impatience and restlessness with that other sort of dominant voice, to kind of find out. And I wound up in this adolescent place inside of my imagination, and these kind of kid-like sentences came out, and I liked them. They felt so real, and I needed them, but they alone couldn't operate. I like the contrast, this tension between that sort of adult but lost voice, you know, the grieving husband. And then the kid says, I'm going to find her.
Yeah.
I can't say that. I mean, I can't say that, but the kid can say that. And so that kid opened up that part of my imagination that I'd never used as a writer. And, you know, I was very relieved and happy.
So how connected is the kid, Space Boy, to like the younger Jeff? You write a lot about being in your 20s. You write about riding motorcycles around the country, a very different persona than we might see you now as a, you know, very erudite, professorial man of letters, very serious. What is the sort of continuum between Space Boy and the young man? Are they the same person, or are those distinct?
Yeah, you know, I think that's a really smart question, and you know, I think the implied answer is right. I think, you know, there is a continuum between the two, and I think part of the sort of can-do spirit of Space Boy is that, you know, he's been released himself. I mean, he's been in the closet for quite some time, and I do think that Space Boy is that part of me that when I got married was sort of set aside, like, you know, a jacket you no longer wear, a bicycle you no longer ride. I think he was a part of me that as I became an adult and a married man, and also, you know, a professorial type, that he got left behind. And so he was called upon, and, you know, and he responded. And yeah, he is. He's like the knucklehead that goes off on a small motorcycle to Florida from Buffalo. And
I love that you say the unspoken fundamental truth of motorcycle riding is hemorrhoids. Persic never quite gets to that.
Yeah, would that it were not true.
You've ruined the romance for a lot of people just with that one word. So actually, for the readers who are just discovering you, can you just like tell us how you got here? I know you have taught writing, but you also, you know, you do a lot of, you know, mixed media, radio, film studies, that sort of thing. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background and you know, how you arrived in the sort of academic life that you and Claire had together? She was an academic as well, a Chaucer scholar, among other things.
So the two of us met in Washington, D.C. I had gotten the job at George Washington University a year before she did, and I was on the hiring committee that I was looking for medievalists, and she was much pursued, and we were surprised that she took the job from George Washington. And so we met there. We mostly kind of talked about teaching together, and eventually just started hanging out and really liking each other's couple. And then we're a couple. So it's nice. It was sort of a nice beginning, and that sort of is in the book. What's also in the book is the fact that I was, as an academic, very unhappy. I was really tortured as a young academic, mostly my fault. I grew up in a working class world, and so I just had trouble kind of adjusting to some of the, you know, the postures of academic people who really mostly come from upper middle class backgrounds, with professional parents and that sort of thing. And I didn't adjust well. I should have, and it was really my fault. But I was an angry young man during those years, and it was so funny.
No less. So yes.
Yeah, it's kind of sad how I've mellowed out. You know, Space Boy, I don't think he's mellow. And so then maybe that was part of the fun of kind of bringing Space Boy, you know, out of mothballs, is that he didn't suffer that kind of mellowing out that I have. So we met there, and Claire, you know, made it much easier for me to adjust to kind of being a normal academic. But I think down deep, I still always felt restless in doing that sort of thing. And it was at that point that, well, maybe about when we moved to Iowa City, I really got interested in filmmaking. And they had Iowa then had a really nice film program, and I started teaching taking classes in filmmaking and just got really excited about it in a way that I was not getting excited about doing scholarship. I liked teaching, that was fine, but scholarship, you know, that kind of writing, no, it really wasn't that fulfilling. Even though I did one of those books, you know, that's what I felt like I had to do. And I finally did one of those books, and I put in so many footnotes because, you know, I wasn't convinced that I was really sort of a scholar in the true sense. So I kind of, this sort of defense mechanism, I overcompensated by putting an enormous number of footnotes. And so I really sort of hid the truth pretty well in that book. But I did do an academic book, and it wasn't bad. It was kind of fun, but it was nice to return to this kind of writing. And, you know, unfortunately, when I returned to nonfiction, it was with this book about Claire. The first book, nonfiction book I did, Oppenheimer's Watching Me, is a cultural history of the Cold War, but through a boy's point of view. Living with nukes was, you know, if you live with nukes, it's truly amazing experience. And that book, you know, really was about death, but death was kind of a metaphor. It was a metaphor for the really weird practices that were going on. And in that case, death really was sort of a cultural, it was a sort of a cultural metaphor that America was acting out, that had trespassed into the psyches of little people, little kids like myself. And so that was, you know, the feeling I had was that was really an awful trespass for kids back then to have to deal with the vague and terrifying shapes of death that our culture was constructing for us. And I think the culture too sensed that there was a trespass, that the government and the militarized government in its pursuit of nuclear bombs and nuclear terror had committed against its own people. I mean, culture was young and innocent too, and then we had to deal with this.
The duck and cover years, yeah.
The duck and cover my ass, it was, you know, prepare to die. And the duck and cover years. So that was my first work of creative nonfiction. And I don't think it would have been possible had I not been doing filmmaking work and doing sound work too, because cutting there really taught me something that, in a way, it kind of de-academized my sentences, because you grow up writing sentences that are overly embedded and that are overly syllogistic. I mean, you're always trying to make sense explicitly, and you know, we know that creative writing does quite the opposite. It evokes, it doesn't explicate. But we're always explicating in the academic world, and so it's really hard to cut a sentence short. And film editing actually taught me how to do that. It made possible writing my first memoir.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and so, you know, then I was able to kind of break free from that kind of mode. But any fellow academic writers out there know that it's a really powerful mindset. It is powerful stuff, but you know, it's like the bat suit. Once you get it on and you don't know how to really manipulate it, you can't get it off. And so that it took some doing.
So I want to talk about the way you incorporated some of Claire's scholarship into this book. You do a really gentle and seamless job of weaving some of her ideas in and out. There's a really light touch to it, but it's also a real tribute. So can you tell us a little bit about her academic work and what you admire most about it and what you wanted to do in terms of incorporating it into this memoir?
Yeah, that's another good question. That's a tougher one to answer, but let me give it a try. Claire was a medievalist and a nationally recognized medievalist. And what was so interesting about her work was the almost working class ethos behind her project, which was to find the most low-lying popular level of medieval culture and rescue it in a way. And so, you know, she was interested in popular theater that would occur in the streets, like mumming. Mumming, I had no idea. What's mumming? I would ask Claire. And mumming was very, very popular in medieval culture, and only recently has mumming been considered a really important part of medieval literature. So she was part of that movement that was trying to capture and reckon with these sort of non-poetic, non-kind of highbrow forms of medieval culture. I really like that part of her project. And, you know, she comes from working class family too. And so, and that ethos I really recognized and kind of admired in her work. And it was really, really selfless. I mean, she spends so much time in archives and big museums working with the 14th and 15th century manuscripts, books that, you know, you had to be surveilled as you work with them, and where you were only allowed certain kinds of pencils and certain kinds of
You wear gloves. You have to wear gloves.
Yes, yeah, you know, it's kind of like it's like a Tom Hanks Da Vinci Code sort of thing, and she'd spend all that time in there, and I really, really admired the kind of the amount of work and how detailing it was, and the writing was really quite brilliant, and she was quite selfless. I mean, I considered myself selfless, but I was a raving egomaniac next to Claire, and I sort of admired that about her. And so the whole body of work was really quite impressive. The last point, which would interest you, is the opportunity she had to write creatively about her own body. She, as you know in the book, she had really bad hearing. She had really screwed up hearing, and it got worse, and it was sort of a really tense part of her life. I think it, you know, created an enormous amount of stress that she never talked about, but she could write about it, and she kept a notebook, a little journal on it. And I said, that's great stuff. You should really, really write about it. You've done this stuff, you know, move on to something that might be fun. You know, you have there's gonna be an audience for that, talking about your hearing, how I can't hear and all the rest. And she said, yeah, I know that. But then more opportunities came up to do these academic things, and she was so committed to the project of you know, rescuing medieval popular culture that was so ephemeral that she never did. And you know, of course, I'm in my space boy mode. I'm going, do it.
Mhm.
It's good stuff.
Well, she may be. So it's interesting that hearing you, there are a lot of references to music in the book, not least of all the subtitle. Where does Suite for Cello and Sad-Eyed Lovers come from? And was music a part of your lives as a couple despite her hearing issues?
No, it really wasn't because of her hearing issues. And yeah, I mean, we liked the same music, but she could never hear it.
Wow.
And then when she could hear it, it was too loud, and she didn't like it. And so, no, it wasn't. And the music metaphor in the title is pretty much drawn from the work of structuring the book around all of these planetoids and
Yes.
planets and things like that. So that came a little later, and when I was trying to resolve the question of structure. I mean, it's a hard one when you're doing a memoir. You know, I mean, it's really hard to figure out how to structure something. I could have just let it go, or I could make it a little more artificial with the planet stuff. So I decided to do that, which is more of a kind of a postmodern turn, is to use these planets and the space boy kind of thing. So that was a bit of a risk in my eyes, because I know that, you know, in grief literature, earnestness and solemnity, these are the things that seem to kind of work for people. But this wasn't that kind of book. It really wasn't a solemn book. It was more of a crazy book, a quirky book. And and not an earnest book. And so in a way, the chapter scheme is kind of tongue-in-cheek, the way that Space Boy winks, you know.
Yeah.
And so the last thing is the the subtitle, Suite for Cello and Sad-Eyed Lovers. So I was trying to figure out a way to kind of make that purposeful, and I kept listening to Gustav Holst's The Planets, and it worked. I mean, that you know, the music really speaks to me. And then when I learned about his interest in astrology and why he named those particular movements, you know, Mercury, Mars, you know, the beater of heads, you know, Venus, the lover of this and that. I mean, it seemed so kind of awkward when I first looked at that, but then I kind of liked it.
I think that's a lot of the reason that I admire this book so much. It's not earnest, it's honest, and it's serious and it's sincere, but it's not earnest. And you really give yourself permission to play around with stuff. And I think one of the things that happens in grief memoirs is there's this formalism that arises out of the author's own sort of sense of withholding. It's almost like out of respect for the person who has died, or for the genre in and of itself. There's like places that somehow cannot be explored, or there's tone, you know, there's like tonally, I think authors sometimes feel hemmed in. I mean, I have to say, I think I'm one of the few people for whom Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking is not their favorite of Didion's. Yeah, okay. Radical honesty, because it has the sort of illusion of being kind of loose and just kind of it's not meander. It has this sort of it wants you to think that it's this kind of stream of conscience, but it feels almost like constipated to me in places. And what I love about Planet Claire is you really allow yourself to be an artist, and you allow yourself to take chances and take your reader along with you as you try different things, all within the framework of mourning this person and delivering a grief memoir. So I'm curious, like this conceit of the planets and Space Boy, that it sounds like that came about because you couldn't figure out how to structure the book. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, Space Boy was kind of a key in helping me figure out the planet thing. I mean, without Space Boy, there wouldn't be planets. There was the dream too, that I was visiting Claire.
Yes, tell us about that.
Yeah, so I love B-52, but I never heard the song Planet Claire. I had a friend who told me that I probably did, but it remained in my subconscious. But I never heard that song, and I had this lovely dream very early on after Claire died of visiting her in this otherworldly park. And it's just a beautiful space, and we're sitting on this gorgeous wooden bench. And immediately I sensed that there was no death in this world. You know, it's just sort of kind of a beautiful intuitive thing. There's no death here. And I said, wow. And then so we chat and we hug, and then she goes, there's no death here, you know. I go, right. She goes, there's no time either. And I go, wow. She goes, this is Planet Claire. And I wake up and I go, wow. And so I said, you know, that's the title. And by then, Space Boy had already been in the scene, and so between that dream and the device of Space Boy, I needed to work with the planets. I figured that would be my best solution if I wanted a more interesting structure, and so yeah, that's how that happened.
So I want to make sure that we acknowledge the lovely and inimitable Anne Hood, whose imprint, Gracie Bell imprint of Akashic Books, published this book. Is that an imprint that is focusing on books about grief? I think, are you the second title?
Yeah, I'm the second one.
Yeah.
Happily and luckily, I'm the second one in Anne Hood's imprint that Johnny Temple and others at Akashic Book are publishing. So yeah, I think it's such a bold and brilliant task by the publisher and by Anne Hood to do this, because it's sort of amazing. I had my share of kind of reaching out to agents and to editors, and they just said, sorry, we can't do grief memoirs.
Well, that's why I was asking. So because the structure is so unorthodox for a grief memoir, were you getting pushback from literary gatekeepers, various basics in the publishing business? And I was wondering, yeah, how you got to Anne and Akashic.
Yeah, so no, I found, I was just kind of, I had to search a little harder for a publisher this time around. And I couldn't tell what the reasons were from other kind of mainstream publishers, why they weren't interested. They loved the writing, they said, and, but, it's just not for them. And a couple agents were really upfront. They said, this is great stuff, but I can't sell a grief memoir.
That's so peculiar because everybody has people who die.
Yeah.
By definition.
I don't know if it was just sort of like, an anti-grief mood at this particular time because, grief books have done well, but I was sort of puzzled by that. So I had to search harder, and so I was very interested in working with a indie press. I was very interested in Grey Wolf, but Grey Wolf, they're really big now, and so they're hard to. Yeah, they're really big, and so when I found the Gracie Bell imprint at Akashic Books, I was really excited and interested, and so I did the usual thing, and very happy when I.
And Gracie Bell, named after Anne's daughter, who died when she was 5 years old of a strep infection. I remember when that happened. It was so shocking. And
I'm reading The Knitting Circle by Anne right now, and it's such a beautiful book, and it feels so familiar. It's really, and she's doing the same thing in a completely different way, but it's funny on some level there, even though there's fiction here, and then there's this sort of like crazy nonfiction over here, there is some sort of level at which these two books are the same. And it feels like I've entered a world I know.
Yeah.
I recently visited.
So, were you in real life having to deal with the sort of grief industrial complex in the aftermath of Claire's death? Were people telling you to go to groups, or were they handing you like really stupid books about how everything happens for a reason, et cetera, et cetera? How did you navigate that kind of terrain?
I guess I was lucky. I was pretty much left alone.
Okay.
And which was, which suited me fine because I've always been something of a loner, and and that was I was grateful about that. I read some of those books, and I read all the grief memoirs, and the grief memoirs, with the exception of Joan Didion, were really interesting. But they didn't speak to me, and I think I took a peek at the. The list, what's the list? Things that are going to happen to you. The formula, right, for grief. Anger.
The 5 stages.
Kubler-Ross thing, the Kubler-Ross thing. Yeah, I mean, I was curious. I took a look at that, and it was kind of silly, really. And so it's interesting, and I think that's almost really a trope you hear from other people other writers who are in that mindset and are dealing kind of in language with it. None of the stuff is going to speak to you. You're pretty much on your own.
Yeah. I want to ask you, you don't talk about this in the book, but I'm going to ask it because I think people are probably curious. You guys did not have children. You're married for 25 years. Was there, I would imagine that adds a dimension to the grief experience that is, it's one that I think a lot of people don't touch on. Like, you have a spouse die, and usually, because most people have children, I do not, so I'm allowed to ask this, usually that is a component. So I'm wondering, you had to deal with all of this on your own. Is that something that you thought about putting more of in the book, or was it not of any interest, or is that for later? I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I wasn't terribly interested in that question until an early, a friend writer who had, wondered about that. Well, why didn't you guys have kids? Readers might be interested. So I said, okay, I'll think about it. And so there are imaginary kids in the book. I don't know if you remember that sequence. There are imaginary kids in the book.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes.
And so, and they turn out really bad. So, that was it. And the funny thing is that Claire and I just, I don't know why, but we said if we ever had kids, they're going to be awful. I don't know why we said that, but we were convinced,
Wow.
that they would be monsters.
So we're going to wrap up pretty soon, but I think this is really, I want to get to this, to some extent. Like, what was your life like as a couple? You didn't have kids, so you've got a different, arguably more intense, more intimate relationship just as husband and wife. Were you traveling a lot? I know you had been in Dublin shortly before she died. What kind of life did you have as a couple and as a writer couple?
I think because, well, one thing is we did talk literature. I wanted to talk literature, but then I would become this really meathead of a professorial type, and she would cut me off. And this was really great about Claire, is she just had no time for bullshit. And I would kind of, I'd want to lecture on Beckett or Shakespeare over coffee in the morning, and she could see that look come over my face, and she would cut me off, roll her eyes, and she would have none of that. So we never did that sort of, we never had one of these kind of like high concept conversation. We never had those conversations about literature. She was really down to earth, and she made sure that I stay that way, which is why poor Space Boy was kept in the closet for a long time. So we had, we would have fun talking about, home repair and gardening, and we traveled a lot. That was the big thing. We lived in the Midwest, and the Midwest was fine when we were working, but it's not, it's pretty empty there. So to make it work, we traveled an enormous amount, and we loved traveling together. We were good traveling companions. So that helped a lot. Every once in a while, we'd say, we don't have any kids. And we go, yeah. Well, what do you think? And I go, well, we don't have any kids. Where do you want to go tomorrow? We had a dog, and and that worked for us.
So what did you do with the dog when you traveled? This is the problem.
Well, the dog
never goes to college, so what do you do?
I know, yes. I think early on we were in Alaska and then New Mexico, and we couldn't take the dog with us, and so Claire's family would take care of the dog, and they're wonderful people, and they were really good dog setters, and the dog ate a lot. He really enjoyed his days there. But otherwise,
I don't normally ask authors and during my author interviews what they do about dog sitting, but it seemed it seemed relevant. So just to kind of close out here, I know you've recently retired from teaching. You were teaching writing at the University of Iowa. You and I know each other through the nonfiction program, the creative nonfiction program in the English department. What has it been like teaching writing in the last couple of years, and what is it like not teaching it these days?
Well, it's I mean, the world when we had lunch together, the world was quite different when we last spoke in person. Really, and it wasn't that long ago, but it was a very different world. I got out just this last spring semester. I retired, and I spent the semester teaching on Zoom, and that was so weird. Poor colleagues, spent the fall, and now they're spending another semester doing it. It's hard to, and I think from what I understand, it's just grueling to do that kind of work and kind of soul crunching. Teaching, since you were there, is pretty much the same, except that, because the program in Iowa is so well regarded, we keep getting these very, very capable writers from all over the world. So it's really interesting and everywhere. And so the student body, the 12 students who come in every semester are very, very diverse, very, very smart, and very, very talented. And then you have a white, we have these, you know, white teachers there. And that was problematic. And, you know, I think it still is. I mean, the whole department's very, very white, the whole university, the whole town, the whole state. So I think that's been something that they're struggling with. But they're doing their best to struggle with that. And teaching, you know, it's kind of wonderful teaching these very, very diverse and talented youngsters, but they also come from, you know, well-off backgrounds. And so I remember teaching in the program back when a lot of the students were, you know, holding 2 jobs, but had a love of writing and were going for a degree. But, you know, they had difficulty making ends meet, and, you know, they were from different age groups. Some of them were 60 years old, some were 40 years old. Now they're all, you know, they're 24 and they're from Ivy League schools, either in this country or some other country. And so the demographics of, you know, creative writing departments or creative writing programs is a little more challenging. And as a working class guy, I would have some trouble with that.
Yeah.
You know.
No.
I loved my students. I mean, they're really marvelous kids, but they were privileged. You know, they're privileged kids.
Yeah. Well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you one must be privileged in order to pursue something as
that's it. What a terrible
not necessarily you know, it's not crucial to society that people get MFAs and MAs in writing. So it will attract a certain crowd. Well, I'm gonna ask you one last question. I'm supposed to call Daniel Golden back in. Okay, hello. We're gonna tie things up here a little bit. I guess, you know, I was curious. You know, this is the kind of book, a grief memoir, by definition, is the sort of thing that no matter how extraordinary an achievement it is for the author would rather the book not have had to come into existence. If things had not gone the way they did, if Claire had not died, if this book had not come about, what do you think you would have been writing this whole time?
Yeah, that's another good question. I've actually thought about that too. Yeah, I mean, that's a paradox. It really is a paradox. What was the next book in my lineup? I have, you know, I think we talked a little bit about this. I have done work in the past on cultural history, so I was really interested in cultural history of fringe groups like the UFO folks.
I remember that.
Yeah, I still am, and I'm going to do a project eventually on that culture. And so I might have begun working on that book, you know, and it would be more of a documentary book with a lot of field work, some of which I had already done, but so maybe something like that. But I would have been stuck in that same voice, so who knows how I would have solved the problem then, you know, or maybe I would just continue to kind of be that person. So yeah, there was that. And then the project I'm working on right now, which is more fun, is a novelized oral history of my Sicilian family. My grandparents came over and they had, you know, quite a crazy life in Buffalo, New York. And my mom and her sisters and her 7 siblings grew up in a really, really crazy household. That was run by this wannabe mafioso guy who's really colorful and scary in many ways. And I had over the years collected on tape stories of the family. And I never knew really what to do with them. And recently I transcribed it all and got it down on paper. Now I'm trying to build a narrative. The only way to do that is to actually novelize it. So it's this novel about poor Sicilian immigrants who kind of grow up in a very, very strange household.
That's That sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to that. Well, is there anything you want to add, Jeff? Is there anything I have failed to ask you?
No, those were really brilliant questions.
I don't know
I had to
about
work hard.
brilliant.
I had to work to answer those questions.
Oh, okay. Wow.
What are you working on right now?
Well, I've started a podcast actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, one of the questions I had, maybe we can talk about this offline sometime. You know, this whole, I know you're a big radio expert and enthusiast, and you know, I've always loved radio, and I love talking and just voices. And so I've loved doing the podcast, but I'm curious, people who care a lot about radio, if they have feelings about the whole podcast revolution, if there are things about it that you think are lacking, or anyway, we can talk about that another time. But
Yeah,
I've started a podcast, and it's a lot. I like it. It's a lot better than writing. Let's just put it that way.
huh. Well, you're good.
It's fun. So yeah, just trying to stay relevant. That's all I can say. That's all any of us can do. So anyway, well, congratulations on this book.
You too, and thanks so much, for blurbing and for being
thanks for asking me.
a great interviewer.
It's my privilege. So anyway, all right. And thanks, Dan. Thanks, Milwaukee.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you at another event.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Megan.
Okay.
See you later.
Jeff, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.